3 columns of smoke rose over the valley that morning, each one thin, each one alone. From the ridge, a man stood watching them the way another man might watch 3 candles burning down to nothing. He was not counting the smoke because it was pretty. He was counting it because he knew what thin smoke meant. Thin smoke meant careful fires. Careful fires meant families rationing wood they did not have enough of to begin with. By the second week of that winter, one of those columns had already grown thinner than the other 2. He had seen this before. Not the smoke exactly, but the shape of it. The particular kind of quiet that settles over a homestead when a family stops adding wood to a fire because they are trying to make what little they have last one more night. He had lost someone to that kind of quiet once, and he had promised himself he would notice it the next time. So he noticed it now. What he did next did not look like help. It did not look like charity, and it certainly did not look like sense. He walked between 3 cabins that winter, cabins that belonged to 3 families who barely spoke to one another, and he asked them something none of them expected. Not for wood, not for money, for their roofs. By the time the first hard frost came, those 3 roofs were no longer 3 roofs at all. They were one. One fire, built into the center of all 3 homes, was meant to carry heat through walls that had never shared anything before, not tools, not trust, not even conversation across a fence line. The neighbors who heard about it laughed at first, and their laughter was not unkind exactly. It was the laughter of people who had survived enough winters to know that fire does not travel where you want it to. Fire goes where the wind lets it, and wind does not care how clever your plan sounds. What none of them knew yet was how close that single fire would come to failing before it ever had the chance to save anyone. And what none of them could have guessed was what those 3 families would still be doing around that one hearth, together, long after the snow that tested it had melted. If you are watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where in the comments. Stories like this one survive because people still take the time to remember them. And if frontier ingenuity like this means something to you, subscribing helps keep these stories alive. The valley had 3 cabins in it that year, spaced far enough apart that no one could hear a neighbor's axe, close enough that everyone still knew exactly how much wood was stacked against everyone else's wall. In the first cabin lived Daniel and Alice Merrick, married 2 winters and parents for less than 1. Their daughter had been born in late summer, small even for a newborn, and by the time the first frost came, she had developed a cough that would not fully clear. Alice kept the fire low during the day to save fuel for the night, when the cough grew worse, and the cabin needed to hold heat until morning. In the second cabin lived Henryk Kowalski, who had crossed an ocean with his brother's family 6 years earlier and buried that brother the following spring. Henryk farmed the rockiest ground in the valley, land no one else had wanted, and he had learned to distrust anything that arrived looking like a favor. He split his own wood, salted his own meat, and had not asked another man for help since the funeral. In the third cabin lived Constance Fenwick, a widow in her 50s who had outlived 1 husband and 2 of her children, and who had opinions about nearly everything, most of them correct. She kept careful records of her wood pile in a ledger meant originally for tracking eggs, because she had learned the hard way that a woman alone could not afford to guess how many nights of fuel she had left. None of the 3 had asked the others for anything. Pride ran through that valley the way frost ran through the ground. Quiet and constant and impossible to see until something cracked. By the second week of December, all 3 wood piles had shrunk faster than any of them wanted to admit. The autumn had been wetter than usual, which meant more of the standing timber had gone soft and slow to burn. Green wood does not warm a cabin the way seasoned wood does. It smokes more and gives less, and every one of the 3 households was quietly burning wood that was not ready to be burned, because there was nothing else left to put on the fire. From the ridge above the valley, a fourth column of smoke rose from a fourth, smaller cabin, one that belonged to no family at all. It belonged to a carpenter named Ezra Wren, who had built half the barns and root cellars in the county, and had learned, over many winters, to read a family's condition by the smoke over their roof, the way another man might read it by the look on their face. That week, he stood at his own doorway longer than usual each morning, watching 3 thin columns of smoke rise into a gray sky, each one struggling on its own, each one convinced that no one else could see how close it was to going out. He was not counting the smoke out of idle habit. He was counting it because 6 winters earlier, he had watched a 4th column go thin in exactly this way, over a cabin that had once been his own, and he had not understood in time what that thinning meant. Ezra Wren had not always paid this much attention to a neighbor's chimney. 6 winters before the Merricks, the Kowalskis, and Constance Fenwick came to share that valley, Ezra had lived in a cabin at its far end with his wife, Ruth. He had built that cabin himself, proud of the joinery, prouder still of the stone hearth he had set into its center, and he had believed, the way a younger man believes many things, that skill alone was enough to carry a family through a hard season. That winter had been longer than most, 6 weeks longer by the accounts people still gave years later, and somewhere in the final stretch of it, Ruth had fallen ill with a fever that would not break. Ezra had kept the fire burning as high as their wood allowed, day and night, certain that heat alone could hold back whatever was happening to her. He had not noticed, until it was far too late to matter, that the cabin's single fire could not warm the back room, where she lay nearly as well as it warmed the room where he sat waiting. The stone hearth he was so proud of sent its heat outward in a wide, uneven circle, strong near the fire and weak by the walls, and Ruth's bed had been pushed against the coldest wall in the house. She did not survive that winter. Ezra buried her in ground so frozen it took him and 2 neighbors the better part of 2 days to dig deep enough, and for a long while afterward he stopped building anything at all. When he began working again, he began asking a different kind of question. Not how to build a stronger wall or a bigger hearth, but how heat actually moved once it left a fire, where it pooled, where it thinned, and why 2 rooms warmed by the same flame could feel like 2 different seasons. He studied the barns he was hired to raise, and noticed which corners stayed frost-free through the night, and which never fully thawed. He watched smoke from other men's chimneys, the way it curled when a flue was drawing well, and the way it stalled and spilled sideways when something inside was wrong. By the time he settled in the small cabin above the valley, where the Merricks, the Kowalskis, and Constance Fenwick now lived, smoke had become his private language. He could look at a column of it from half a mile away and know, with unsettling accuracy, whether the fire beneath it was thriving or barely holding on. That December, all 3 columns told him the same story, and it was a story he recognized in his own bones. 3 families, 3 fires, 3 separate battles against a season that did not care how proud any of them were. He had learned once, at the worst possible cost, what it meant to watch a fire fail alone. He did not intend to watch it happen again from a ridge, doing nothing but counting smoke. The morning Ezra Wren walked down from the ridge, he did not go to the Merricks first, or to Henrik Kowalski, or to Constance Fenwick. He walked to the empty stretch of ground between all 3 cabins, where the land dipped slightly, and the 3 homes sat closest together. And he stood there for a long time with a coil of rope and a stick he used to mark measurements in frozen dirt. Constance Fenwick saw him first, from her kitchen window, and came out with her shawl pulled tight, and her expression tighter still. "You're standing on nobody's land and everybody's land at once," she said. "That's either very clever or very foolish." "Might be both," Ezra admitted. He told her what he had in mind, plainly, because he had learned that plain words wasted less of a person's patience than careful ones. He wanted to join the 3 roofs into a single connected structure, close enough that one fire, built into the shared center where he now stood, could send heat through all 3 homes at once. Not 3 fires struggling separately, but one fire working harder, feeding 3 families through channels built into the walls and floors between them. Constance did not laugh, but she came close. "You want to tie my house to Henryk Kowalski's house, who has not said 12 words to me in 3 years, and to the Merricks, who have a sick baby I have never once been invited to see?" "I do." "And you think a single fire can do the work of 3? "I think 3 separate fires are failing right now because none of them are big enough, steady enough, or fed with dry enough wood to do the job alone. One fire, tended properly, built with the right channels, could hold more heat longer than any of the 3 of you can manage apart." She studied him the way she studied her egg ledger, looking for the number that did not add up. "And if it fails? If your one clever fire goes cold in the middle of the night, you've tied 3 families together with nothing to keep any of us warm." It was a fair question, and Ezra did not pretend otherwise. "Then we've lost what we already had. But right now, all 3 of you are already close to losing it separately. I'd rather fail once, together, where we can fix it, than watch 3 good fires go out quietly where nobody notices until morning." Henryk Kowalski, when Ezra reached his door an hour later, listened with his arms crossed and said almost nothing until the end. Then he asked only one question. "Whose wood feeds this fire of yours?" "Everyone's," Ezra said. "Equal shares, or as close to equal as we can measure." Henryk did not answer that day. He simply closed the door, gently, which from a man like Henryk was closer to agreement than anyone expected. For 4 days, nothing happened. Ezra's proposal sat over the valley the way weather sits before a storm decides which direction to take. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the temperature dropped harder and faster than the almanac Constance kept on her shelf had predicted. Ice formed on the inside of window glass by mid-morning, something none of the 3 households had seen that early in the season before. Alice Merrick woke to find her daughter's cough had thickened overnight, and she stood over the cradle for a long while before she put on her coat and walked, for the first time in months, to a neighbor's door that was not her husband's. She went to Constance Fenwick's cabin, not because they were close, but because Constance was the only person in the valley who might know whether a cough like that meant something worse than a cold. Constance did know, or knew enough to be afraid of it, and it was Constance who suggested, stiffly, that perhaps the carpenter's strange idea deserved a second look before either of them dismissed it out of pride. By that afternoon, all 3 households stood together in the space between their cabins for the first time anyone could remember. Not as neighbors exactly, but as people who had each quietly done the same math and arrived at the same uncomfortable answer. None of them could survive what the almanac was now predicting, a hard frost arriving weeks early on the wood they currently had and the fires they currently kept. Something had to change, and the only proposal on the table was Ezra's. Henryk agreed first, tersely, on the condition that the wood contribution be tracked openly in a ledger, so no one could later claim they had given more or less than their share. Constance produced her egg ledger on the spot and offered to keep the count herself, an offer that told Ezra she had already decided to trust the arrangement, even if she was not yet ready to say so out loud. Daniel Merrick agreed for his daughter's sake, before he had fully understood the engineering involved, which worried Ezra more than it reassured him. There was no time left for anyone to feel entirely certain. The ground was already beginning to harden in a way that would make digging channels and foundations far more difficult with each passing day. Ezra had perhaps a week, likely less, before the frost he was trying to protect them from made the very construction meant to stop it nearly impossible to finish. They began that same afternoon. 3 families who had barely spoken in years, now measuring rope and marking frozen dirt together. None of them certain whether they were building something that would save them, or simply making their coming failure a shared one. The work did not go smoothly, and Ezra had not expected it to. Joining 3 separate roofs meant more than laying new beams across the gaps between the cabins. Each structure had been built at a different time, by different hands, with different notions of how high a wall should stand, or how steep a roof should pitch. The Merrick cabin sat lowest, dug slightly into the slope for shelter from the wind. Henrik's cabin stood the tallest, built with timber he had felled and squared himself. Constance's cabin fell somewhere between the two, older than both, its beams silvered with age but still sound. Ezra spent the first 2 days simply walking between them with his measuring stick. An old, worn length of oak marked with notches from 100 earlier projects, translating the mismatched heights into a plan that could tie them together without collapsing any one of the 3. The physical work fell to all of them, whether they had the skill for it or not. Henrik, it turned out, had more carpentry sense than he had ever mentioned, and by the second morning he and Ezra were working side by side with the wordless efficiency of men who trusted each other's hands even before they trusted each other's intentions. Daniel Merrick, better suited to hauling than to fine joinery, spent most of his days carrying timber and stone up from the creek bed, glancing back toward his cabin every few trips to check on Alice and the baby. Constance, sharp-eyed and unwilling to simply watch, took charge of measuring and marking, catching 2 errors in the framing before they became expensive mistakes. The central structure, the room that would house the shared fire, rose in the flat space between the 3 homes. Ezra built it with a wide stone hearth at its heart, thick walls of packed earth and stone around it, and channels cut into the connecting walls that would, in theory, carry warmed air outward into each of the 3 cabins in turn. Tension surfaced more than once. Henrik grew visibly irritated on the 3rd day when he judged that the channel running toward his own cabin sat narrower than the one running toward the Merricks, and he said so bluntly in front of everyone. Ezra explained that the difference was intentional, that Henrik's cabin sat closer to the fire and needed less channel width to receive the same heat, but the explanation did little to soften Henrik's suspicion that he was somehow being shorted. Constance, for her part, insisted on personally inspecting every stone that went into the hearth, rejecting 3 that she judged too likely to crack under heat, a judgment that later proved correct. By the end of the 5th day, the shared roof stood framed and mostly sealed. 3 homes now physically connected by a single structure none of them had imagined sharing 2 weeks earlier. The hearth at its center sat cold and unlit, waiting. That night, for the first time, all 3 families ate dinner separately in their own cabins, but under a single continuous roofline, close enough to hear each other's voices through walls that had once stood entirely apart. It should have felt strange. Alice Merrick later said it felt, instead, like the valley had quietly gotten smaller and warmer at the same time, even before the first fire had ever been lit. Ezra lit the shared fire for the first time on the morning of the 6th day, with all 3 families gathered in the central room to watch. The flame caught quickly against dry kindling, and for a few minutes the mood in the room was almost celebratory. Henrik stood with his arms crossed, but his expression had softened slightly. Constance held her ledger, ready to note the fire's first hours, as though it were an experiment worth recording. Which, in a sense, it was. Daniel Merrick watched the channel leading toward his own cabin, waiting to feel warmth reach the room where his daughter slept. The trouble began within the hour. Smoke that should have risen cleanly through the central chimney began, instead, to curl backward into the room, thin at first, then thicker, until it was clear something in the draft had gone wrong. Within minutes, smoke had found its way not just into the central room, but along one of the channels, seeping into Constance's cabin in a gray haze that set her coughing and sent her hurrying to throw open a shutter despite the cold. Ezra worked quickly to smother the fire before the smoke grew any worse. His hands blackened, his frustration plain even though he said little. He had built chimneys before, dozens of them, and he understood immediately that the problem was not in the fire itself, but in how the three connected roofs were now shaping the air, moving above them. A single cabin's chimney answered to a single roofline. 3 joined roofs, at 3 different heights and pitches, created currents of wind that no ordinary chimney design had ever needed to account for. Henrik's reaction was sharp and immediate. "This is what happens when a stranger's idea meets our winter," he said, not shouting, but with enough weight in his voice that no one in the room mistook it for anything less than real anger. "We tore apart 3 working homes for smoke in our lungs." Constance, still coughing, did not disagree, but she did not join Henrik's anger either. She simply looked at the blackened stone of the new hearth and asked the question that mattered more than blame. Can it be fixed, or was this always going to happen? Ezra did not answer right away. He walked outside instead, into the cold, and stood looking up at the place where the 3 roof lines met, watching how the wind moved across the uneven joints between them. Alice Merrick found him there a few minutes later, her daughter wrapped tightly against the chill, and asked quietly whether they had made a terrible mistake. "I don't know yet," Ezra told her honestly, "but I know smoke never lies about what it's doing. It just goes where the air lets it. Something in that roofline is pushing air where it shouldn't go, and if I can find where, I can fix it." It was not the reassurance she had hoped for, but it was the truth. And that night, for the first time since the work began, all 3 families went to sleep uncertain whether the shared fire that was meant to save them might instead have made their winter worse. Henrik Kowalski was the last person Ezra expected to find, waiting outside the central hearth before dawn the following morning. But there he was, hands in his coat pockets, watching the cold chimney as though it might explain itself if he stared long enough. "You're still angry," Ezra said, joining him. "I'm still awake," Henrik answered, which was not quite a denial. After a moment, he added, "My brother built a chimney once, in the old country, that smoked for a full season before an old stonemason fixed it in an afternoon. I watched him do it. I didn't understand it then. I understood it enough to know it wasn't magic. It was watching." That admission, more than any apology, was what allowed the 2 men to work together that morning without argument. They stood outside for nearly an hour before the fire was relit, watching how wind moved across the valley and struck the joined roofline from different angles as the morning light shifted. Henrik noticed first that the wind, funneled by the taller pitch of his own roof, seemed to strike the central chimney at an angle that pushed air downward into it rather than allowing smoke to rise freely out. Ezra tested the theory by relighting a small, contained fire in the hearth and watching where the first thin traces of smoke gathered before they built into anything dangerous. Just as Henrik suspected, the smoke hesitated and pooled exactly where his roofline's angle met the chimney's opening, caught in a small pocket of pushed-down air before it found its way back into the room instead of escaping above it. The fix was not elegant, and it did not come from a book or a formula. Ezra built a simple angled cap over the chimney opening, a design he had seen used on tall barns to deflect similar cross-drafts, adjusted by trial until the angle matched the specific way wind moved across their particular joined roofline. Henrik cut the wood for it himself insisting on doing so, and the two men fitted it into place before midday. Constance, watching from her doorway with her ledger in hand, noted the hour they finished as carefully as she had noted the hour the smoke first went wrong. Daniel Merrick, less interested in the mechanics and more interested in the outcome, asked only one question when Ezra came to tell the families the fire would be relit that evening. "Will it hold this time?" Ezra did not promise that it would. He had learned, at great cost, never to promise a fire would behave exactly as intended. What he could promise was smaller and truer. "We understand it better than we did yesterday. That doesn't mean it's finished. It means we know where to look if it isn't." That evening, the fire was lit for the second time. And this time, the smoke rose clean and steady into the darkening sky, thin and white and unremarkable in a way that felt, to everyone watching, like the most important thing they had seen all week. With the smoke drawing properly, the real test began, and it was a quieter, slower test than the dramatic failure 2 days earlier. It was simply a matter of whether one fire could truly warm 3 homes through a full night, evenly enough to matter. By midnight, the difference was already noticeable, though not equal. Henrik's cabin, closest to the shared hearth, and fed by the narrowest of the 3 channels, grew warm quickly, warmer in fact than he was accustomed to from his own fire alone. Constance's cabin, situated at a middle distance, warmed more slowly but steadily, and she noted in her ledger, with something close to satisfaction, that her usual midnight chill had not yet arrived by the time she finally went to bed. The Merrick cabin told a different story. Positioned farthest from the central hearth, it received the last and weakest share of the warmed air traveling through the channels, and by the coldest hour of the night, Alice noticed that the far corner of the room, where the cradle sat, remained noticeably cooler than the air near the door. It was not dangerously cold, not the desperate chill of the fires they had kept before, but it was not the full warmth the shared system had promised either. Alice did not wake Ezra that night. She moved the cradle closer to the connecting wall instead, where the warmed air seemed to gather most, and she sat beside it for much of the night with a blanket around her own shoulders, listening to her daughter's breathing settle into something steadier than it had been in days, even if the room itself was not yet perfectly warm. In the morning, when the families gathered again at the central hearth to assess the fire's first full night, the news was mixed in a way that satisfied no one completely and discouraged no one entirely either. Henrik admitted, with visible reluctance, that his cabin had been warmer than usual. Constance reported a night free of her typical midnight chill for the first time in weeks. Alice reported, more carefully, that her daughter had slept longer than she had in days, but that the far corner of their cabin still ran noticeably cooler than the rest. Ezra listened to all 3 accounts without interrupting, turning the measuring stick over in his hands the way he did when a problem was still taking shape in his mind. The system was working, clearly, better than 3 separate fires had managed on their own. But it was not yet working evenly, and the Merrick cabin, home to the smallest and most fragile member of the valley, was the one household that could least afford to wait for an uneven system to slowly balance itself out. "It's not finished," Ezra said finally, more to himself than to the others. "One fire can carry 3 homes. I still have to learn how to make it carry them fairly." Outside, the sky had turned a heavier gray overnight, low and close in a way that Constance, glancing up as she gathered her ledger, recognized from long experience as the kind of sky that did not stay quiet for long. The disagreement that nearly ended the arrangement did not start with smoke or wind. It started with a stack of split logs and a question of who had cut them. 4 days after the first full night of shared heat, Henrik walked to the central hearth at dawn and found the woodpile lower than his own count in Constance's ledger suggested it should be. He said nothing at first, only recounted the logs twice, then a third time, before he brought the matter to Ezra directly. "Someone is burning more than their share," Henrik said. "I split wood for 2 days while my own fields sit unattended. I did not do that so another man's fire could run hotter than mine." Daniel Merrick, when the accusation reached him, did not deny that his family's portion of the shared fire had been running longer through the night. He explained, with some difficulty, that his daughter's cough had worsened again 2 nights earlier, and that he had quietly added extra wood to the central hearth after midnight, hoping the additional heat might reach his cabin's cold corner faster. He had not asked permission. He had not written it in Constance's ledger. He had simply done it, out of the particular kind of fear that makes a father act first and explain later. The argument that followed was not shouted, but it was sharp, and it exposed a tension that had been sitting quietly beneath the whole arrangement since the beginning. Henrik felt his labor was being spent unevenly. Constance, caught between both households, pointed out that her ledger existed precisely to prevent this kind of dispute, and that the system only worked if everyone trusted it enough to write down what they took as honestly as what they gave. Daniel, defensive and exhausted, said the only thing he could say honestly, which was that he would make the same choice again if his daughter needed it. It was Alice who finally broke the standoff, and she did it by bringing something with her from the cabin. It was her grandmother's measuring cup, small and dented, brought across an ocean 2 generations earlier and used in her family for baking bread through every hardship anyone could remember. She set it on the table beside Constance's ledger. "This is the only thing of value I have that isn't a debt to anyone," Alice said. "I'll trade nights minding the fire, extra hours, whatever it takes to make it fair. But I won't apologize for what I did to keep my daughter breathing, and I won't let this fall apart over logs we can still count and replace." The cup did not solve the argument by itself, but it changed its shape. Henrik studied it for a long moment, then looked at the ledger, then at the cough still faintly audible from the Merrick cabin through the connecting wall. He proposed, gruffly, that Daniel take on an extra half-day of Henrik's fieldwork the following week, in exchange for the wood already spent, an arrangement Constance recorded in her ledger without comment, though she allowed herself a small, satisfied mark beside it. The fire kept burning that night, evenly rationed once more, but something else had shifted in the room, where 3 strangers had become, however reluctantly, people who now owed each other honest accounting rather than silent resentment. The storm Constance had read in the sky 4 days earlier arrived on a Thursday night, and it arrived larger than the almanac had predicted, larger than any of the 3 families had prepared for, even with a working shared fire between them. Snow began falling before sunset, and had not slowed by midnight, driven sideways by a wind that seemed, at first, no different from the wind Ezra and Henrik had studied and corrected for the week before. The angled cap over the central chimney held as designed, and for the first several hours of the storm, the fire drew clean, and the 3 cabins warmed steadily, better than any of them had managed through a storm in years. The trouble began sometime after midnight, when the wind, which had been blowing steadily from the same direction it had struck the roofline during Ezra and Henrik's earlier observations, shifted. It was a change none of them had tested for, a hard turn that sent gusts across the joined rooftops from an angle the chimney cap had never been built to handle. Constance noticed first, waking to a faint but unmistakable smell of smoke drifting into her cabin through the connecting wall. She dressed quickly and went to check the central hearth, where she found smoke once again pooling near the chimney opening, thinner than the first failure, but building. By the time she reached the Merrick cabin to warn them, Alice was already awake, her daughter coughing harder than she had in days, the smoke thinner in their room but present, curling in low along the floor where the baby's cradle sat closest to the connecting channel. Daniel was already at the hearth, uncertain whether to feed the fire, smother it, or seal the channel and risk losing all heat to his daughter's room in the coldest hour of the storm. Ezra arrived within minutes, roused by Henrik, who had felt the wind shift against his own roofline and understood immediately what it meant. There was no time to build a new cap, no time to test angles the way they had in calm daylight a week earlier. Ezra had only the choice in front of him, made in the dark, with the storm still rising outside and a sick child's breathing growing more labored by the minute. He chose to partially seal the channel feeding smoke back into the Merrick cabin, sacrificing some of the warmth that room depended on most, while opening a secondary vent Henrik had insisted on building days earlier, one Ezra had considered unnecessary at the time, and Henrik had built anyway, quietly, without asking permission. That vent, cut into the wall facing away from the shifted wind, gave the smoke somewhere to escape that did not require fighting the storm directly. It was not a perfect fix. The Merrick cabin ran colder for the rest of that night than it had any night before, but the smoke cleared, slowly, and the fire held. No one in the valley slept again before dawn, each family listening through the walls to the storm outside and the uncertain quiet within, waiting to learn whether the choices made in the dark had been the right ones. The storm broke sometime before sunrise, the wind dying down almost as suddenly as it had turned, leaving the valley beneath nearly 2 feet of new snow, and a silence that felt, after the night's fear, almost unfamiliar. Ezra was the first outside, checking the chimney cap and the secondary vent Henrik had built, both intact, both doing exactly what the previous hours had demanded of them. He found Henrik already there, having reached the same conclusion by the same instinct, and the two men stood together in the early light without speaking, watching a thin, steady column of smoke rise clean above the joined roofline. Inside the Merrick cabin, Alice sat where she had spent most of the night, her daughter finally asleep against her chest, breathing easier than she had in hours. The room was cooler than the other two, and Alice knew it, but it was not the desperate cold of the winter before Ezra's fire, and for the first time since the storm began, she allowed herself to believe the worst of the night had passed. Constance arrived at the central hearth mid-morning, ledger in hand as always, though what she recorded that day was different from her usual careful accounting of wood and hours. She wrote down the storm's approximate strength, the hour the wind had shifted, and the fact that the fire, tested by conditions none of them had planned for, had held. She would later say it was the first entry in that ledger that felt less like a record of debts and more like a record of something worth remembering. By afternoon, all 3 families had gathered at the central hearth without any particular reason to do so, drawn there simply because it had become, without anyone deciding it formally, the one room in the valley that belonged to all of them equally. Henrik brought extra wood without being asked, setting it beside the hearth in full view of Constance's ledger, an unspoken acknowledgement that the accounting between them, while still useful, no longer needed to carry the weight it once had. Daniel Merrick, watching his daughter sleep peacefully near the warmth of the shared fire for the first time, without the anxious vigilance of the nights before, finally asked Ezra the question he had been too afraid to ask during the storm itself. Did we build something that works, or did we just get lucky last night? Ezra considered the question honestly before answering, the way he answered most things. Luck doesn't build a vent before it's needed. Henrik did that, days before any of us knew we'd need it. What we built works because enough of us were paying attention to different parts of the problem at the same time. That's not luck. That's just what happens when people stop trying to survive a winter alone. Outside, The valley lay quiet under new snow, 3 rooflines joined into one beneath it, a single thread of smoke rising steadily into a clearing sky. Word of the joined roof and its single fire traveled slowly through the county that winter, the way most things traveled in a valley where neighbors were measured in miles rather than doorsteps. It was not carried by any grand announcement. It was carried by a traveling peddler who had stopped at Constance Fenwick's cabin for shelter one night and left the next morning describing, to anyone who would listen, 3 families warmed by one hearth, built by a carpenter who had once lost everything to a winter very much like the one he had just survived. 2 more households in the county attempted something similar in the years that followed, though neither joined 3 homes as completely as Ezra, Henrik, the Merricks, and Constance had. Most who heard the story simply remembered it as an oddity, an unusual solution born of a hard season, filed away alongside other frontier stories of families who had found strange ways to outlast winters that should have broken them. Within the valley itself, the arrangement did not end when that particular winter did. The 3 families kept the shared hearth through the following seasons, refining it slightly each year, Henrik eventually widening the channel toward the Merrick cabin once Ezra determined it could be done safely, evening out at last the imbalance that had nearly cost them so much during that first storm. Constance's ledger, the one originally meant for counting eggs, filled over the following years with entries that had little to do with wood or debts owed. She kept it anyway, out of habit, and later out of something closer to sentiment. A record of a winter when 3 households who had once barely spoken had learned to measure their survival by the same fire. Alice Merrick's daughter grew up in that valley, healthy despite the cough that had frightened her parents so badly that first winter, and as a grown woman she would tell her own children about a grandmother's measuring cup that had once sat on a table beside an argument over firewood, and about a single fire that 3 families had built together out of necessity and kept together out of something that had grown, slowly and without anyone quite naming it, into trust. Ezra Wren never built another shared hearth of that exact design, though he was asked more than once. He told those who asked that the design itself had mattered less than the people willing to stand outside in the cold, watching wind and smoke together, willing to admit what they did not yet understand. The valley eventually forgot the exact measurements of the channels, the precise angle of the chimney cap, the specific arrangement of stone that Constance had once inspected so carefully. What it remembered, in the way small places remember things, was simpler than any of that. 3 families had once been 3 separate fires, each one dying quietly and alone. They had become, by the end of that winter, one fire that none of them could imagine letting go out again. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is a reconstructed narrative inspired by frontier building practices and is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.